Hello, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. Welcome to episode 4 of this series 10 Texts on Sculpture with Andrea Franchi. Today we are looking at Rosalind Krauss's seminal essay from 1979, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. Alongside Krauss's essay, we also bring in a chapter of Tina Post's book called Deadpan, and we bring in a chapter that she has on looming and threat to help us think back and kind of critically think about Krauss's historicisation of artwork made by North American artists in the 60s and 70s. We talk about the difference between strong and weak theory. I keep mentioning Benjamin Buclow's book on Richter. I think I read a review of it in the LRB. I think it's there you go. Gerhard Richter, Painting After the Subject of History by Benjamin Buclow from 2022 on MIT Press. I keep mentioning that for some reason, can't remember why. We talk about the Klein group, this diagrammatic structuralist approach that Krauss uses in her text. I mentioned Rose Lee Goldberg's another kind of big, strong theory, art history in this case, of performance art. Her work, I think it's Performance from Futurism to the Present, or from 1909 to the present. And, you know, we talk about a lot of different artists. We talk about Robert Morris, but we also talk about people like Adrian Piper. So, you know, we kind of talk about the artists that Krauss uses in her text, but also artists that Krauss explicitly doesn't use, even though they were working on the same scenes as the artists, the kind of minimalist and post-minimalist artists that Krauss is talking about. All right. Hope you enjoy this conversation. I will see you back here at the end. I'm here with Andrea Franchi.
Hello.
And today we're going to look at Rosalind Krauss's, I don't know, kind of seminal, but also quite, controversial and maybe a bit problematic essay from 1979 called Sculpture. Is it on the expanded field or in the expanded field?
In the expanded field.
Okay, cool. All right, and then we're also going to bring in quite particularly some other texts. So in particular, Tina Post's, a chapter from Tina Post's book on, I should probably have had this. Her book is called Minimalism and the Aesthetics of Black Threat. Oh, no, sorry. The title of the chapter is Minimalism and the Aesthetics of Black Threat. And the book is called Deadpan, the Aesthetics of Black in Expression. And that is a chapter, we'll get into it, but it's a chapter that tries to recontextualize aspects of work made by black artists, firstly as minimalism, and minimalism having something to do with threat or this notion of looming, which is quite interesting. Anyway, we'll get to that later. But we'll really focus on Rosalind Krauss as the text. This will be the close reading, and then we'll bring those other things later. The other thing we might do is bring in a bit of Robert Morris's Notes on Sculpture, which was published in the 90s, but were originally, as a book, but were originally published in October magazine. No.
Yes, so they were published in different places, but some of them Art Forum, I think some of them in October, and then the Notes on Sculpture 2 was published on Art Forum on the same edition that published the Michael Fried Art and Objecthood. So it's like, so his texts are like really, really like in dialogue with whatever is happening now. That edition also has Dunos Judd writing, so which I think, it's just important to kind of like as a context of something that is written in the middle of a discussion, which I think is a bit different to Krauss text in that sense.
Yeah, Krauss is really historicizing. She's kind of constituting, I don't know, that's actually not quite right, is it? She's trying to conceptualize what has happened, you know, the actual activity that's happened in American sculpture over the past 15 years from 79 back to the mid-60s. So I think of it as a philosophy of art text. Would that be fair to say?
I don't know. I guess so, because I think she's one of the things that I feel like I kind of fail in kind of like the understanding of this text, that it feels to me that there is a context to this text that I completely do not understand. So it's like she's criticizing historizations of like minimal art and like post-war sculpture in America, but I don't know who these people are, because I have never, you know, like reading Morris, for example, talking about his relation to like historical artists. He's already doing what Krauss is doing, so I don't understand who, but clearly she's writing against something that is happening at the time, but I couldn't figure out what was it. Yeah,
I think that's super interesting. I hadn't actually noticed that. Basically, the text theorizes using a diagram, essentially, and is it called a Kleinian's diagram? I can't remember what it's actually called.
Kleinian
diagram, a Kleinian square or something. All these different relationships between architecture and landscape and their negatives, which she then uses to kind of classify lots of different kinds of sculpture. So land art, earthworks, and she has different phrases for these. But, you know, all the kind of crazy stuff that was happening, like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty or Christo wrapping buildings or whatever, she suddenly like discovers or elaborates this conceptual framework which makes sense of it to her, and put sculpture in an expanded field of other practices, this kind of site construction, all these other words she uses. We'll get to that. But the point being that she kind of claims that this is a rigorously logical framework for postmodern art. And she's positioning this against what she says. I think she basically doesn't like the way that some art historians or some critics have called sculpture in the 60s and 70s eclectic or just diverse or just, you know, eccentric, you know, like, oh, they're doing all these crazy things and no one can really explain it. And she's like, no, here's all this framework which helps make sense of it. I thought it was interesting, just to start this off, I thought it was interesting that Krauss doesn't really use the phrases that we use to describe quite a lot of the art that she's referring to. She does use minimal sculpture, but she doesn't say minimalism. She doesn't say land art or installation. She doesn't seem to be really interested in labeling movements, but rather finding a way to understand all these objects that she's looked at.
Yeah, including the fact that, for example, Morris does things in the 4 categories. So those categories is not you'll be an artist that does one type of thing. Like she's literally looking at the field of sculpture in itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So she says that most art, or like a lot of those artists will operate across those different categories. So she's looking at the actual artworks rather than the artist being a minimalist or whatever, or being an earthwork person. I don't know Mary Miss. So Mary Miss is the first artist she mentions. She starts with a description of that work called Perimeters, Pavilions, Decoys from 1978. Do you know Mary Miss?
No, but can I just say, I don't like this. I didn't like this text very much, but I think the first sentence of this text is like amazing. I think it's one of the best first sentence on an art essay that I have ever read. I think it's just really, really good.
Can you read it? What is it?
It starts with, toward the center of the field, there is a slight mound, a swelling in the earth, which is the only warning given for the presence of the work. I just think it's really great. And even like, I don't know, this kind of like phenomenological thing, and you're kind of like feeling the relation to the land, this way of, describing this like perception of like almost liminality, where you're kind of like feeling that there's something there. But yeah, I just think it's a great, great sentence.
Yeah, that's really nice. The reason that really got me was, I think it's like the next paragraph or whatever, and it lays out what she's trying to do. Over the last 10 years, rather surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Narrow corridors with TV monitors at the ends, large photographs documenting country hikes, mirrors placed at strange angles in ordinary rooms, temporary lines cut into the floor of the desert. Nothing, it would seem, could possibly give to such a motley of effort the right to lay claim to whatever one might mean by the category of sculpture, unless, that is, the category can be made to become almost infinitely malleable. And when I read that, I was suddenly like, oh, okay, because I've always thought my own practice is very made up of lots of disparate strands of like performance, video, sculpture, like discourse-based stuff, like that's influenced by social practice, whatever. But I'd trained in sculpture, and I really liked the idea that, like maybe all of this stuff is sculpture. Maybe there's a reason that all of this stuff is coming out of my training in sculpture or something. So on a personal level, I was struck by the notion that I could have a relationship to a medium that I thought I'd kind of lost, or that I was like wallowing in having lots of different kinds of practices.
To me, that's what's interesting about the essay, is that she does this opening up, but then she says, no, like sculpture is this kind of like this really, like the expanded field of sculpture that she maps is a really narrow expanded field. And I think she ignores so much of the sculptural thing that is happening at the time, like, the video and conceptualism and the relation to like happenings, and you could say like towards like social practice, like all of those things have already happened for 20 years, 25 years. But it feels like in the end, her understanding of sculpture is still quite limited in a sense, or like, I don't know if you're understanding, but the kind of the framework she's giving to think about sculpture, it feels quite limited to me.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely get into this later, and that's why Tina Post is quite interesting. But what she does that I think is maybe limiting is that she removes the body from sculpture, from what a lot of people were doing around then. Like you say, there's no performance. If there's Richard Long pieces or whatever, they're the photographs, as a mark in the landscape that is sculpture. There's no mention of the fact that mark was made by a body, or that Bruce Naumann's corridor pieces only make sense when the audience walks down. There's no mention of participation, there's no mention of performance, and there's no mention of the body as a kind of part of the work.
And the conceptual side, right? So what happens when you would just do a list of instructions for a sculpture? That's also not covered.
I think that's interesting. I think at the time, to be honest, when I was reading this, I was interviewing for this job that I'm now doing, like in sculpture, teaching sculpture. So I kind of just thought of it, and this is like the lazy way that artists work, right? I was like, oh, cool, everything could just be sculpture, which is exactly the sort of thing she doesn't want, really. I was like, oh, video could be sculpture. But yeah, she's explicitly not talking about video. She's explicitly not talking about performance. But I almost think you could make, now this is silly, but you could make like a 3D version of this diagram and overlaid onto all of the types of work or the complex interactions that she puts out on that grid would be a version of that work with a body in it. Does that make sense?
Well, it's interesting because to me, my reaction is like that sort of strong theories are always wrong. So I'd never go to try to solve it and make it include more things. I'm just like, why are we doing this? Other than, being an academic exercise. And I think we can talk about this, but my experience was I read this text once and then I didn't get it. And then I realized that she talked about Morris a lot and about minimalism stuff a lot. So I went and I read a lot about minimalism, which is something that I thought I understood. And then I realized I didn't understand minimalism because I always looked at it as a movement instead of looking at the artist. And then I read all this stuff and I was like, oh my God, minimalism was amazing, was incredible. And it's connected to all this. And that's the thing that I like, is the variety of the specificity of the thinking and the things that are working against. So I don't know, what do you gain if you add the body to this kind of massively generalized thing that is trying to almost extinguish something, is think about something in a way that can understand its totality. Well, I think that's always a doomed exercise, but I think that's how my brain works in general.
Yeah, that's interesting. The way I think of it is that I love these kind of texts because they offer a limited and necessarily reductive framework that you can think with, but you can then start thinking against, as we're going to do today. And actually what I really appreciated was this kind of almost fable-like quality of the tale of modernist sculpture that's on page 34. I know the whole point of even this entire exercise, 10 texts on sculpture, is to challenge bigger narratives around sculpture. But I also really appreciate knowing those little fables that are reductive and kind of limiting ultimately, because as you say, then it makes sense when you read the essays or read the text or understand the artist pushing back against those stories. So for her, did you kind of note that little fable about Rodin and about things coming off the pedestal? Was that of any interest to you? Okay, cool. Do you know that story already? For me, that was a kind of oh yeah, okay. Now I have a little story to tell about sculpture or something. Does that sound funny? I don't know. That's how I think about it.
I don't know. I feel like it's such a way of thinking, this kind of collective anecdotes to think as a way to understand things.
Totally.
Which I quite like because there are things that come into anecdotes that cannot come in just a theory or something.
Anecdote. That's an interesting phrase. Okay, so I'll just tell the tale of the anecdote. So for Krauss, sculpture is essentially, for most of its history, is monuments, right? It's big recreations of figures put on big pedestals in a particular site to mark and monumentalize someone or something or some event.
So I'm just gonna interject is that I think she doesn't delineate, but I think there's a very Western specific history of sculpture that is not generalizable. And I think if we were talking about sculpture and thinking about Asia or Latin America and other places, you wouldn't frame it like that. But but I think in terms of an European, US based fine art genealogy, I think it makes sense. But
okay, no, that's really important to say. I mean, she does make it explicit that it's going to be about post-war American art. So I suppose it's implied that it's this big European story of art. But yeah, she never mentions the fact that elsewhere it wouldn't make any sense at all. So then what happens with modernism is that sculpture loses its relation to site and it stops being a monument. And she uses Rodin's Gates of Hell as her example because basically it was a commission for a particular place, but it got turned into such a crazy sculpture that the commission was rejected. And then Rodin just had to like make versions of it and sell it as a standalone sculpture. So it doesn't stand at its original site that it was built for or made for, but instead it stands in lots of galleries around the world. Then her claim is that Brancusi starts absorbing the base into the sculpture. And this is a kind of evolution of that idea of it losing its site. So the base becomes part of the sculpture. So you can, conceptually, you can kind of pick it up and put it down anywhere. Of course, that isn't true practically because sculptures need to be, might be really heavy and made out of bronze or whatever. So they can't just be like plonked anywhere. But the point being that the idea of that sculpture changes from something that is cited and about a particular place or thing or event and actually becomes a piece of gallery art. So it kind of attains a different status. And then she says by 1950, this vein was exhausted. So this classic modernism was exhausted. And that's when she brings in Morris, right, as her archetypal example of sculpture that is pure negativity, she says. It's not landscape and not architecture. It's the thing in the landscape that is not the landscape and the thing in or outside or near architecture, a building that is not the building. Is that about right? That's her little story, isn't it? Of sculpture up until the mid-60s.
Yeah, and you buy it. You think this makes sense. So I'm not...
I think that in terms of a little part of the fable of modernism in general, it's like a neat summary. But, modernism is always a fable for for the point you make that it doesn't apply universally, but it's meant to be, universalizing art history. And for many other reasons, just because like modernism itself is like a kind of construction or whatever. Like if you look at, Latour's idea of we have never been modern or something, it's like it relies on cutting off so many bits of history of human experience that it's kind of a false idea anyway. But do you not buy it for other reasons? I
think I have a personal problem with Krauss because we read Krauss for other things so far, and I always have a problem with her writing, but because she does a gigantic argument against genealogies and how genealogies doesn't help and genealogies are forced and this idea of historicizing, and then that's like a massive genealogy and historicizing which I think is like extremely selective, and I think, I don't know, if you think about the Renaissance and you think about, the history of like art going out of like a religious environment and going into like a bourgeois, I don't know how you call it, like environment, like I think that those transitions are so much more complex and interesting. And it's not, what is then, if sculpture only comes from those monuments that I guess are like religious or political, then what are all these like three-dimensional objects that were being made and circulating and being seen and admired and placed in houses? And I don't know, there's like all these objects like automata. I don't know, there's like a history of like three-dimensional objects made for people that are like admire as artists.
Okay, I think that's really completely key. Sorry, go on. No, finish that thought, sorry.
I don't know, it was just that this has to ignore all of that to create this genealogy, which is exactly what she has been arguing against in the text.
I think that is really, really true. That's just a very good critique. But I would also say that one key thing about this text, and I didn't realise this till I read it the last time I read it, which was yesterday or whatever. Sculpture, she says, is in an expanded field in the sense that sculpture is one part of that expanded field. And there's always been other forms of 3D object. But in the West, what she's saying is they've never really been labelled as sculpture. I mean, that's the problem, is she doesn't say in the West they've never been labelled as sculpture. But the point being is that she talks about things like Stonehenge or something. In the West, that never counted as sculpture. But now, in the 70s, when she's writing that text, ideas of like, maybe like, Robert Morris is doing sculpture like Stonehenge. But actually, Robert Smithson is doing sculpture like Stonehenge, but actually previous to Robert Smithson, no one would have ever invoked Stonehenge in relation to sculpture because it wasn't thought of as sculpture. So the point she's trying to make is that sculpture now stands in relation to these other practices, which maybe have always been around, but haven't really been thought of in relation to sculpture. So I do take your point, but I also think that she is, because she's being really specific and also really vague at the same time, she's kind of making this particular argument, but she's not contextualizing it as much as she could.
Yeah, I think she's just doing a genealogy to justify, which is the thing that she's criticizing, but it's the thing that I think is super interesting. And I think, one of the things that's interesting about like reading artists, for example, for example, what we read with Philippa Barlow last week is like Philippa Barlow is saying she's placing her genealogy with a specific set of American artists, and she's saying, well, Anthony Caro actually is not part of my genealogy, and there's a value in those selections. And I think in that sense, to me, it makes perfect sense to do the, Rodin and then Brancusi and then Robert Morris and say, well, and actually, I don't know, Naungabo is not part of this genealogy. That is what genealogies are, and it makes perfect sense. But it's just funny to me because she just spends like 3 paragraphs saying that is a wrong way. It's like a wrong intellectual method to understand things.
That's true, isn't it? And I guess that's the point. That's the point that we got to last time. Was like, oh, it's so lovely to read an artist because they don't have to pretend that they're making a coherent argument. They're just kind of telling you how they got to where they are and what they think they do and why they think they do it. It's methodology rather than, a claim of like specific methodology rather than a claim of like theory. Yeah, like you say, strong theory or kind of philosophy that's universally applicable. So I totally agree.
But I love the anecdote, and I love the bit about Brancusi because I think I think Morris will refer a lot to Brancusi when he starts thinking about leaving the plinth behind and what does that mean to have a completely different relation to the floor and to space.
Yeah, so actually, I just want to bring this up because I thought this was really interesting. I didn't read as much of the Robert Morris stuff as you did, but I did read Notes on Sculpture 1 and 2. One particular thing that Rosalind Krauss says is not true. She says that minimalism and any work after that, she says it doesn't have any relationship to constructivism because constructivism used all these new materials, but it used it in a way that she says was alluding to transcendental ideas of purity and idealist ideas of like, we're leaving material behind and we're entering the realm of pure spirit or whatever. But one of the first things that Morris does in his Notes on Sculpture is go, is it Garbo I think he uses?
Yeah, he talks about Garbo, maybe like Pevsner, Tatling, I don't remember.
But he's talking about constructivists as saying like that was the first time that this kind of work was done where like they were using all this new material and it was just what it was and nothing else. So he basically does exactly what Krauss doesn't like. So like it's almost like Krauss is saying, no, Robert Morris, you've got it wrong about your own work, which is really lovely as well. Like, yeah, it made me think of this recent book that's just come out about Richter by Benjamin, is it Buchloh?
Buchloh,
Yeah. And like I just read a review of it, which basically says like, Benjamin Buchloh really just wants Gerhard Richter to be an artist that he isn't. Like Gerhard Richter has consistently said that he's not a lefty, basically. He's not interested in socialism. And Benjamin Buchloh's entire book of essays, written over like 40 years is just trying to claim this guy for like progressive, politics.
I think claim is a good word. I think that's what annoys me about these essays, that is claiming certain works and certain art to kind of like pursue its own agenda.
So why is it okay when an artist does that? Because I really do think it's okay when an artist does that. But why is it problematic when a theorist does that? Is it because they're claiming they're not doing that? That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think because this has a vibe of neutrality, right? This has a like a, well, Morris, for example, or like Donojo, they're saying like really like. There's not a claim to neutrality, it's a polemic, right? Well, like they will say, oh, this is not, all art should be about phenomenology or whatever. And then 4 years later, he's doing something completely different. And it's like, oh, whatever.
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, at one point, Robert Morris just says something like, you can make relief sculpture and that's always been valid, but now it isn't. He just says it. That's like his argument. It's like, no, you can't put it on the wall anymore.
Yeah. And then he moves to do anti-form like 4 years later, which is like this cut felt that it's on the wall, literally.
Right. Okay. So he just goes back. Well, not goes back at himself, but yeah, just changes tack, I suppose. Okay, but we should talk about the diagram because that is, or the Klein group, that's what it's called. Okay, so she sets up this idea that sculpture in the early 1960s is pure negativity. It's not landscape and it's not architecture, and it's always, the good sculpture is always that. That's what sculpture becomes. And then she basically says this implies architecture and landscape. So you then have these 4 terms, positive and negative terms, that can interact. Landscape, not landscape, architecture and not architecture. And then you can Google it, just Google, the title and look at images. You'll see the diagram. And there's basically this set of interacting terms. So obviously landscape. So you have this sculpture, which is not architecture and not landscape, but then you have all these other terms that interact. So landscape might interact with not landscape, or landscape might interact with architecture, or landscape might interact with not architecture. So these other different kinds of relationships. And she then says, oh yeah, I thought it was interesting as well that she calls the field a domain of postmodernism. And I think, and maybe you can correct me, this is quite an early instance of someone basically being comfortable with calling what they're doing like, okay, maybe this is a theory of postmodern art, or like this is a theory that relates to postmodern art. I don't know if you know anything more about that.
I don't know enough. I know October Magazine and Foster are quite implicated in at least most of the, like, you know, the theories of like postmodernism in art that I've read, but that's as far as so I can imagine this is part of that.
Yeah, because it's like a positive definition of postmodern art, right? Instead of just saying like, oh, modernism's just fallen apart and it's all mad. She's like, well, actually, this is a logical operation that happens within, you know, a postmodern historical time. She then says there's definitions or examples of the other bits of the field that aren't sculpture, so aren't this interaction between not landscape and not architecture. Okay, I wrote a little list. So landscape and architecture, she calls that kind of artwork site construction. And the examples she gives are like earthworks, like the Mary Miss piece, I think. Then landscape and not landscape, she calls marked sites. And that's like Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. But also photographic stuff like mirror displacements in the Yucatan. Who's that by? Is that Morris or is that Smithson as well?
I think that's Smithson.
Okay.
Lots of people are using mirrors at the time. So there's like mirror in rooms is one person, mirror in the garden is Morris, mirror somewhere else.
It's their version of like pot plants in the early 2000s or something. Everyone's getting mirrors and taking them out. And then the final one is architecture and not architecture, which she calls axiomatic structures. So a good example of this is like Christo's, is it Jean-Claude and Christo? I can't remember what then.
Yeah, I think so.
Partner's name is. Anyway, they're wrapped buildings, but also like Naumann's. What? Sorry?
The wrapped buildings. I love the idea that axiomatic structures are wrapped buildings. Sorry, that's not what you said, but that's what it sounded like to me. Sorry.
And then now Bruce Naumann's corridors. So his pieces that she doesn't really mention this, but they have CCTV cameras and monitors in, and sometimes they have light and stuff in. So what she says, this is the quote, what appears as eclectic from one point of view can be seen as rigorously logical from another. But within the situation of postmodernism, practice is not defined in relation to a given medium, sculpture, but rather in relation to the logical operations on a set of cultural terms, for which any medium, photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, or sculpture itself might be used. So that's the expanded field, right? Is that sculpture is just now one way of like getting into these different relationships. So, okay, should we unpack that a bit? What do you think about all these definitions like site construction, marked sites, and axiomatic structures? Do you get that? Do you think that works?
I mean, I spend a lot of time figuring out exactly like, you know, what is the difference between like a site construction, which is like you're going to a place and you're building something, to a mark site, which is like you're going to the place and you're just like leaving a mark on that place, to axiomatic structures, which is you're like functioning like architecture. So you're like, it's about like opening and closing of things, which again, very close to site construction, right? And then you have sculpture, which to me is like this massive field that again has remained unexplored. I don't know. I don't find this, that's what I meant. Like, I don't find these definitions helpful. Like, they don't give me anything. You know, I don't feel like I live here in the same way that, you know, when we talk about Deadpan, and that gives me concepts that I can take into other things and think about. All I can do with this is classify things. You know, it's like play of like trying to figure out who fits into which group. But I really didn't. I read it quite a few times, and I don't know, what did you get out of it?
I think there were just certain moments that were illuminating. Maybe it is. I'm trying to work it out now live, but like in relation to my own practice or in relation to stuff that I really like, that now I think, oh well, maybe it's part of this expanded, or whatever, it's doing something in relation to these things. Like, for example, Christo's wrapped stuff, well, wrapped buildings in particular. Yeah, like, I think that is interesting that it's both architecture and not architecture, which maybe seems obvious in a way, but that just felt like an insight. I don't know, I can't really explain it more than that. And the same with the idea of how photography seems to have this very close relationship with sculpture. And I wonder if it is something about these marked, this gave me an insight into why sculpture might have this intimate relationship with photography, which I think it does in many other ways that are actually to do with performance and stuff like that. But it's kind of implied in this marked sites that, she just leaves out the notion that, there was a performing body there. But I would say that they have a relationship to performance. So those things I thought were like a sliver of light was like opened up, and I was like, oh, okay, so maybe I could think about photography and sculpture in a slightly different way and how it constitutes an artwork or has a relationship to space or whatever. The earthworks, I've never been massively interested in land art or earthworks. Not that I'm not like impressed and like would love to visit like the Spiral Jetty or something, but just they aren't really part of my my own genealogy of art. So that stuff didn't hit me so much. But yeah, I kind of just liked the idea of thinking about some of these artworks, but maybe that's not enough for it to be a coherent theory.
I like thinking about these artworks. I just don't think this has given me anything to really, think about them or like an entry into what those things are doing that is more specific, people are doing like art in the landscape. Like I read it.
Yeah.
And again, it's really complicated because this is a text from 1979. So I don't know if when this came out, this is like, wow, mind's blown. But then reading Robert Morris and stuff, I'm like, well, didn't these people read this in like 65 or 69 before? But maybe that's circulating, in a different, because we're going to read, Robert Smithson. We're probably going to read something about we're going to probably read Donald Judd when we do like the last episode and we're looking at Brazil, because this is something interesting as well, right? This kind of like expansion is happening all over the world in the 60s, and it's conceptualized and it has a very different genealogies, and it's like a really interesting moment. So I'm guessing we're going to read these comparisons then as well. And so it's just really hard for me to situate why this text exists.
Well, I tell you what, like this is an opportunity to think about like why we read something. I think this notion of the expanded field, if you put in the expanded field, there are
so much stuff.
Painting in the expanded field, printmaking in the expanded field, photography in the expanded field. And I think just understanding theoretically who came up with that idea, and like why it's powerful or something, or why it's exciting to people that stuff can exist in an expanded field. Okay,
but that's interesting because there's another way, more cynic, to look about it, that is like where ideas come from. And then what does it mean to create an idea that automatically give authority to everything? Because yesterday I was Googling expanded field and I was looking at MIT books and I was looking about art form, expanded field and architecture. And all of them use the term, but none of them used it for anything. They just use it in a random way because it sounds very sophisticated. So be like, oh, architecture in the expanded field. And I was like, wow, let's see what it is about. And you'll be like, oh, architects are doing some shit. Like, that is not buildings.
Exactly.
They have always been doing that, whatever. Like, it doesn't... So I yesterday, for real, like I spent like 3 hours trying, because I knew the podcast and I was like looking for all this. I wanted to read someone that would contextualize it for me. And I couldn't. I just found lots of people using this term because it's a term that sounds like you know what you're talking about.
It sounds good, right? And this is why I think it's really key to say that Krauss is saying sculpture, postmodern art takes in these other ways of working that are not sculpture. That's her entire point, right? Is that it's not that sculpture expands, it's that sculpture becomes one medium or one way of working among many, which I think is really interesting because later on she criticizes installation art, like actually really recently, I think, over the 2000s, she criticizes installation art for not operating against the ground of a medium, which would be sculpture, right? So that, again, so she makes us kind of a switch. Like she's saying that postmodern art's strength is that it no longer relies on a particular medium of sculpture. But then later on, she kind of shifts and critiques installation art for exactly that same reason. Well, not for a slightly different reason, but a related reason. Anyway, I just think that's interesting because, understanding who came up with that idea and exactly how she used it, and then why it was taken on by everyone else, which is basically like painting in the expanded field. Yeah, I've lent a painting up against the wall. I'm in the expanded field. Or like you say, like just people doing stuff that I'm an architect, but I'm doing something else. Therefore, it's architecture in the expanded field or something. But she's doing something very particular with that, which you're saying doesn't work, which I think is which is completely fine. But
I don't know if it doesn't work. I just don't understand what it actually does in a way. Like it's hard to say if it doesn't work because I don't understand what the intention.
I tell you what the intention is, which I only got from reading Dean Kenning's writing on diagrams, where he locates this essay as like the start of his interest in diagrams. What she's saying is that sculpture from the 1960s has a definitive break with modernism. That is her particular point. What she's saying, that it doesn't have a lineage. She's saying that it doesn't relate to modernist sculpture, and it's a very different way of thinking about the development of 20th century artwork. So she's saying that everyone else who's written about sculpture as like, oh, and this relates to Garbo, or oh, and this relates to Stonehenge or something. What she's saying is that it's a conceptual and logical shift in the minds of artists that is a definitive break with that little fable of, you know, modernism coming down off the pedestal or whatever.
But I think, so to me, especially having read all this stuff about minimalism and the history of minimalism and the things that are written at that time, and to me, my understanding of sculpture at the time in the mid-60s is that you have Clement Greenberg, who's saying, you know, things have to be like modern, who's like the last big like modernist theories, who's extremely powerful. And he's saying things have to be specific to their medium, right? And that's what Michael Fried comes with the art and objecthood. So it's like, if you're doing painting, then painting has to be about painting. That's what modernism is about. Sculpture has to be about sculpture. Modernism, that's what modernism is about. But then you have these young people like Richard Morris and Donald Judd and even the people that are doing happenings and the people that are doing, you know, performance, and the people that are doing conceptualism then are saying, dude, that's bullshit. Like, no, we don't, and they're kind of like pushing for a very different way of thinking about a sculpture, and that's what Michael Fried is reacting against in that essay. So in that sense, like, that's where the expansion happens to me, and that's where the theorization of the expansion happens to me, and the polemic. And this comes like 20 years after that. And in a way, it is still a response, and maybe it's because none of those people, and I think it's interesting, like Krauss started October. She's the editor of October. She has created this massive prestige academic magazine that gives her the voice and the authority to kind of like produce, I don't know, this concept of this discourse, but that has already existed for like 20 years in a very exciting and kind of like, yeah, like, I don't know, like it has been articulated in such an exciting, struggling way for these people that are doing all these messy things and saying we're not going to be limited by that, and art is not about this, and we're not interested in thinking about sculpture in this way, or thinking about painting in this way, or thinking about, you know, dance in this way. So this is like much later, and I don't understand. She's not like creating the space for those things to happen. Those things have happened. They have been like debated, justified. They're like completely mainstream at this point. This is the 80s. It's like,
well, I tell you what, it makes me think a little bit of. Right, so in the same year as this is published, Rosalie Goldberg published a book called Performance Art. I think at the time it was called Performance Art from Futurism to the Present. And I was reading this for PhD stuff, and I was talking to my supervisor about that book, and he was saying, well, you've got to think about it as like someone who's really invested a certain group of artists and kind of wants to, it's like a power grab. She's saying, all right, so it's a very different book, but like these artists that I really like and I work really closely with, they are actually doing something that has historical precedent and historical importance. And that's why they're really important. But she just happens to be working with these East Coast American performance artists and she's kind of canonizing, like constructing the canon of performance art. And I suppose in a very different way, Krauss is kind of doing a similar thing with a group of artists that she really likes and wants to write about or something. She's saying like, no, they're not just messy, eclectic ways of working. They're actually rigorously logical, and therefore I can write about them, in October magazine, which is an academic art theory magazine. Yeah, she is just doing exactly what you're saying. But I can understand, like, that's kind of how art history and theory interact, is that if you can make one of those big strong theories, then you can work for the next 20 years with this set of artists and be like, that's why they're really important. Again, to go back to that Benjamin Buchloh book on Gerhard Richter,
who is also an October writer.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to make that point.
He the reviewer of this big book on Richter says, if you actually look at all the other artists that are like that were doing this stuff about consumer society that Richter does, it's Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons, I can't remember the other person he mentions, but they've kind of all fallen away in terms of like critical evaluation. They still get high prices, but Richter still straddles this thing of being the most gets the highest prices at auction and for sale, and also is critically, like, oh, I'm going to have a big Richter show in my museum and everyone's going to think that's really good. And Benjamin Buclot has basically been part of the reason that that's the case. Like, perhaps if he hadn't constantly been theorizing him as this, like, ambiguous person who's doing this like progressive art about capitalism, he would have fallen into the mold of Jeff Koons, or he would have become like thought of as like, oh, he just does this kind of boring like affirmative art about capitalism or something. So I guess Krauss is like legitimizing herself and also legitimizing a set of artists that she wants to write about. Anyway, that's just whatever, isn't it? But I don't know should we talk about Tina Post, and should we talk about your reading on Morris?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna say one thing, just to like, because I've been like so antagonistic about Krauss, is that one thing that I really like is the thing about sculpture, when she said a sculpture is that what is in the room but is not really in the room, and is in the landscape but is not really the landscape, or like, what is architecture, not really architecture. Like, I feel like I didn't need the kind of like the excitement of like, oh, I learned this way to do diagrams, or you can like mirror everything. And I understand, I don't know, there's something in that kind of diagrammatic and the structuralist move that I don't necessarily think it as anything. But I think the whole thing of like sculpture being a negativity is something that I really love. Like, it's the thing that is not part of this environment, the thing that is like a bit so yeah, just to like give her one thing, because I feel like
I'm with that. I'm with that. Yeah, that was another moment for me where I was like, oh yeah, that's a cool description of sculpture. Like, I'll definitely use that when I talk to students or something, like, this is one way of thinking about sculpture. So yeah, okay, cool. All right, so what do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about Tina Post then? Yeah,
let's do that.
All right, how would you kind of summarize that chapter in that book, or do you want to summarize her whole shtick?
So I would say like that her book is it does something that I really like, which is, I think we're in a moment, maybe I'm in a moment that I'm encountering these things, but I feel like there is a larger moment where we're kind of like rethinking aesthetic categories, and we've been like living in this kind of Kantian, or like, I don't know, kind of very old style aesthetic vocabulary that is about like beauty and the sublime and, I don't know, the ugly. There's like, even not even the ugly, but like there's really, where those things don't really they haven't made sense in terms of like, not only art, but like our aesthetic sensibilities in the world for a long time. And I think we have like, people like Sian Guy talking about the gimmick and interesting and like all these other things. And I think I will fit this book in that moment. So she's talking about these kind of different aesthetic forms that come or make sense when you're thinking about, well, she's talking about American Black art, but I think it could be applied in a larger scale, but because I guess Western art is all influenced by racial relationships in a sense. And then so she's bringing looming and opacity and unreadability and transparency, which is a very specific type of transparency, which is like looking through something, as kind of like an aesthetic language to think about art that kind of come from like a racial context, which I think is sometimes the way she applies the argument, or the way she kind of like, again, like does the historization of the genealogy. I'm a bit like, I think it's a bit dubious, but the concept themselves, I think they're like amazing. They're like really, yeah, they have suddenly made me look at a lot of art in different ways and see things that I haven't seen before. So I thought that was really worth it.
Yeah, I really agree. And just to be clear, that's all these things: looming, threat, dread, transparency, opacity. They're all related to this notion of deadpan being a particularly, I don't know how she phrased it, but like aesthetic category that's assigned to Black Americans, right? African Americans. Oh no, it's just Black Americans. Sorry, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That has like a history of how the racialized body and the racialized affects have been perceived or manifested, or appropriated.
It's not just like, it's always with these new aesthetics books, it's always a kind of historical process that is both, like dialectic or whatever, right? Like it's both part of the object and like constitutes the object because of historical processes. It doesn't just appear or whatever. It's that's really like, that really for me comes from Ahmed and Sian Nai, I think. So this particular chapter is about looming, the notion of something looming, and threat. And I thought they're both really great words. I just really like them. So how does she get to like it is minimal art in particular she's talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about the Michael Fried's text. It's about art and objecthood. So she does a reading of art and objecthood, and she says that when you take away sections of Michael Fried's text and his description of his discomfort in being around minimal art, which is kind of like where his dislike of it comes, like the way he makes him feel uncomfortable, that is very similar to the way that some, like a white person would describe being around black people.
Yeah.
And she goes back. So you were talking about Richard Morris, and she will talk about Richard Morris, but in Notes on Sculpture, Robert Morris. In Notes on Sculpture 2, Robert Morris talks a lot about the importance of scale in minimalism and how they're kind of like it's really one of the things that they're trying to do is have like an anthropomorphized or like a human-like scale, and that's quite specific, and it's quite interesting the specific phenomenological reactions you get from being in a space with these objects that are like in a similar size to you, that they're not things that you can carry around. So it goes back to like the touch and the things that we were talking about in the beginning. It's the opposite of that. It's not like this cute thing that you can put in your pocket or you can hold, but it's also not like this monument thing that is like a massive thing that is far away from you, but it's almost like an object that has can have almost like a dialogue with you. It becomes like something between objecthood and subjecthood. And I think that's what will connect it to this idea of looming, that then these objects are like objects and subjects at the same time are having this relation to you, but they're not giving you any affect back. So you don't know how to relate to them. So they become, for Fried's in Art and Objecthood, they become this uncomfortable space, or this kind of subject things are there and they want you to interact with them, and he doesn't want to. He's like, just give me an Anthony Caro sculpture on the floor, please, that I can look at. But he's not looking back at me. He's not having that kind of like tense.
Definitely.
Do you think that's, yeah?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that relates back to, I was just editing the last episode and we were talking about sculpture that looks back, like returns your gaze almost. And I think that really is what she's talking about, is that sculpture that doesn't just sit there mutely, but kind of you have a relationship with it and you kind of have to deal with it. And it's, slightly antagonistic maybe. So how does she actually get into the discussion of the three black artists? Because she discusses Robert Morris, but she also then discusses three black artists and kind of makes a claim for them. I can't quite work out what she's trying to do with those artists. That's the only bit of the chapter that I couldn't quite get.
I don't get what she's trying to do with these artists
okay.
either. So she's talking about, God, I forgot everyone's names. What's the black artist as a philosopher?
Oh, Adrian Piper.
Yeah, so she's talking about Adrian Piper, which is super interesting because I didn't realize, but Adrian, because I was reading that and I was like, why is she talking about Adrian Piper, which to me was always been a conceptual artist? But actually, and Adrian Piper started by making minimal sculpture.
So if you looked at I can't find any of them.
I found them. They're like, actually, they're very similar to Robert Morris sculptures. They're like massive geometric two-dimensional sculptures. And then from there, and she will claim that as a genealogy, that her sculpture, like her practice is a mix, as an encounter between minimalism and conceptualism, which is really interesting. But I don't think in Deadpan, there's a few books that the kind of like map that relation that Piper has with minimalism, but I don't think she... one of the things we should come back to is that Tina Post is not someone from the arts. So she's someone who's coming from a different discipline. And I think that as artists, that is always, or like someone who's in the art, it's always a bit annoying because there's like some readings there that you're like, there's like this is not how we would interpret things in the art, like map these connections or how we would use those words. So I think, to me, that's what happened with the examples that she maps. Like, I think they're interesting examples in terms of looming.
Yeah, definitely.
And how those artists use looming in their work. But I don't understand why, what applying minimalism to those artists does. So I understand, I think it's really cool. I think the connection between looming and minimalism, and like minimalism bringing looming into the arts as an aesthetic mode that is intentional, which it is, and that has a massive reaction by Michael Fried, it's excellent. And I think looming as an aesthetic category that then we can take on, it has this kind of racialized component, and then it's excellent. And then I think the examples are a bit unsuccessful for me. I don't know how you feel about that.
I completely agree. I think that what it does for me actually really successfully is make sense of why, we've mentioned Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood article. Every podcast, every single one has involved, no, not every single one, but most of them have involved us talking about that essay, which is a widely derided essay. He was on the wrong side of art history, as it were. And people are like, oh, he just didn't understand minimalism. But actually, he is understanding it in a very, very specific way, which is he's understanding it on an effective level that connects his feelings about something with the objects in the room that he's assigning aesthetic categories to. And I think that what she does is make a case for like why that essay actually is a really important essay to read when you're thinking about minimalism and that kind of sculpture. So that's agreed. I think she does a great job of like, I really like the notion of sculpture that looms, because again, in my personal work, I've done stuff where things are above the viewer slightly, but not gigantic, and it makes sense of like this anthropomorphized relationship. Robert Morris says sculpture shouldn't be precious, but it shouldn't be gigantic, and it's like, well, why is that important? And it kind of makes sense of like, an effective relationship you might want to constitute for a viewer. So I think that's really great. But with Adrian Piper, she uses a work from like the early 90s, and I'm just like, I think that minimalism was just really done
flash in the pan. It was like 5 years.
And I just don't think that, I know at that point she wasn't talking about herself as a minimalist. She was talking about herself as I don't know, in the 90s, but she was interested in performance, conceptual art, and philosophy, really. And it's very, very particular. It's very odd. And then even that other book, I only read a bit of it. I can't remember who it's by, but it's trying to make sense of Adrian Piper in relation to minimalism. And it uses a poem she did in 0 to 9, which was Vito Acconci and Bernadette Mayer's magazine, that was really influential. But it's just a great little bit of conceptual art written out as a poem. I just don't really understand why it needs to be. He's trying to make it into minimalism, this writer. And, Vito Acconci did very similar bits of work in that magazine. But you would never bother to try and make Vito Acconci into a minimalist. It just wouldn't be of any use to anyone to mix up those terms. But I don't know. It's interesting to know that's part of her genealogy. That has really helped me, because I like Piper a lot, and I had never looked at those works. So I'll go back and look at those. Yeah,
I think there's a way in which, especially at the time when minimalism is happening, there's a lot of maybe expanded ways of thinking about it that have been taken out of history. But this idea of going back to this basic, actually the minimal amount of things you need to convey certain things, or things when you get the influence of John Cage, which will influence dance, that then will influence the arts. But it's this idea of, he's getting rid of the form. So music is only about duration, but he's not actually playing notes. So there's this kind of idea of removing things. And I think that, there's all these different ways in which those words were circulating at the time that we kind of have lost, because they have become, minimalism has become a certain formal idea of work, in a sense. It's work that is made look in a very specific way, and is made by very specific people as well. And it's also it's super interesting how it is happening with conceptualism, and how those two things are feeding at the same time. So there's another book you read, but it's this guy called Morris Berger, and he wrote this amazing book on Morris. And he has this other book, and he's about minimalism, and talking about Piper, and he's talking about Mary Kelly, and he's talking about, I don't remember what the other, I think Judy Chicago, because those artists all had this start in minimalism, and then they went through these other things. But what are the things that they took with them? Which is something that I've never relate any of those artists to minimalism. And then you see Judy Chicago doing again, the sculptures that she was doing during minimalism, they looked like minimalism. But what she took from that to how her practice continued was completely different to what we kind of think about it.
That's really interesting. Okay, I really take that on board, because I think that's really good, isn't it? Again, to go back to why you might read a set of texts and try and explore historical things that seem largely settled in the 21st century, is to understand that they weren't settled. In the 60s, people were using minimal to describe a range of ways of working, or describing their own work as minimal, but actually doing lots of different things. And what Adrian Piper goes on to do is performance that is very, very simple operations in public space, which is really different to minimalism with a big M, which is just big bits of steel in a gallery or whatever it is.
But if you think that Robert Morris was was doing like, what we think about the canonical minimalism while he was doing those crazy performances at the Jessen Theater. And for him, those two things are the same. Then you can see like those connections are a lot more flexible or like porous. Things are a lot more porous than how we think about them now.
Okay. Do you want to carry on with Post, or should we finish up with a little bit of Morris? Because you became a massive Robert Morris fan over the course of doing all this reading, right?
I said that this episode could be called, as a subtitle, How Andrea Falls Deeply in Love with Robert Morris.
Why did you start reading Morris, and what made you kind of fall in love with it, with his writing?
So Morris comes a lot in the Krauss essay. Like he comes over and over. It's like, as I said, like every example of the 4 categories, there's a Morris. And when she's talking about Marcuse, she will talk about Morris. Like his name comes over. To me, like minimalism was Donald Judd and Dan Flavin. And then the other people that, so Morris was someone to me that was like, he made those like big rectangular shapes. And that's sort of what I knew about him, that he was part of this. I didn't know almost anything. But I knew he did performance, and we were really looking for a text on performance and sculpture, which is we still haven't found the one. So I thought, I'm going to read notes for sculpture. And then I couldn't get it. The first time I read notes on sculpture, I'm like, what is this text? I don't understand it at all. I think I told you, like, you don't have to read it. It's so boring. I couldn't understand why he was talking about these things. And then I just like went on a massive rabbit hole and started reading a lot about the relationship. I found this amazing book that is about minimalism from a dance perspective. So the idea that actually minimalism comes from like Cage influencing dance. And then all these dance people, Simone Forti and Yvonne Rainer, like Simone Forti is Morris' girlfriend, and he starts making these massive geometric structures for her to do her dances, and they actually look like minimalist sculpture. And you'll find Morris saying like, yeah, this is where it starts. And then they go, right. He moves to New York, and then he lives with Yvonne Rainer, and he's doing like these weird sculptures in Yoko Ono's flat. He makes this amazing sculpture. There's a corridor that you go in and you get like more and more like compressed by this corridor. And then the wood from this corridor is the wood that will become his most famous minimalist sculptures. That's kind of the path. But I just, and the way he's always is amazing, because he's always talking about it. He's saying, minimalism comes from Yvonne Rainer, minimalism comes from Simone Forti, minimalism come from all these women who are doing this really radical, weird, really Trisha Brown is like this, dance thing, which is like just someone going down a building by the side and everybody just go there and see it, and how that differs from happenings. Again, it's like there's always this dispute about the genealogies. It's like, why is that not a happening? But this is like close to minimalism. And I think it just felt so different from what I thought was like a bunch of white dudes making these really like male bro sculptures to this other scene that was actually, and again, if you think about Adrian Piper being part of that scene, it's like a scene that is like exciting and porous, and these people are, it's like this whole generation that is reacted to Greenberg and to this, older people that keep saying like, painting needs to be painting, sculpture needs to be sculpture. What are you people doing? And they're just like crossing these boundaries, but in this very kind of like, what it feels at the time, a very kind of like communal and open way of working. So Judd is writing, and again, like Morris, Judd is writing about specific objects, and Morris is saying, I'm not doing that, even though everybody, pairs them together. Like there's something really exciting about this scene, and exciting about minimalism. Like minimalism to me now seems so radical, because it is the one thing that kind of takes against Greenberg and modern. It feels like the thing that kind of like breaks modern, like is the final blow into modernism. And there's something quite heroic and silly and young about it. And and Morris and Judd are philosophers. Like they study philosophy and then became artists as well, which is such an interesting. And then you look at their work and you're like, of course they were philosophers that went to do art, because it's not conceptualism, but it's a very conceptual. They have a goal. They're making those sculptures to make a point about what art should stop being and what it could be, in a sense. It's like those objects are a state in a way that I think, for example, Dan Flavin, like all the other stuff, maybe I'll need to read more about Dan Flavin and then I'll fall in love with Dan Flavin too. But I feel like there's like an intellectual, conceptual side to that practice at that moment that again lasts you could say that Donald Judd goes to be a minimal artist forever, but he doesn't, right? He does his own thing that kind of like follow those principles. But minimalism itself is a very short burst of, it's almost like, making the slate blank, and then after that anything can be, there's space for everything in a way that I think is quite exciting. And I think it's quite sad that it has been historicized in a way that is so, I don't know, formal and empty and commercial in a sense to me. Like,
yeah, I think that's definitely true, right? It's constructed an aesthetic in it's helped to constitute a kind of capitalist aesthetic in the homes of the super rich or something that's like a bit sad. But actually, if you take any of the particular interests that actually Morris outlines in those notes on sculpture, which is about anthropomorphic, about a certain scale, about working with light and space. And then you can trace it in lots of other artists, lots of artists who carried on making work after minimalism as a particular, whatever movement or something was over and done with. And it makes sense of those interests. So yeah, I really agree. I mean, Morris's writing is really nice, and it's very philosophical without being like a big, strong theory of art. And yeah, I'm more and more interested in people, like what you're talking about, this idea of a polemic of artists saying, this is what art should be, but not because this is necessarily what art should be, but just because I really like this kind of art. I think that's really nice.
And he's always changing his mind. So he goes and he does anti-form, and he just, does these felt things, like put it in the wall. And then the whole idea is that, they can never be put in the wall in the same way. So, if a collector buys it or like a museum, they will always have to rehang it differently. And then he goes, like the Tate does a retrospective, what is it, like late 70s, early 80s? And then he decided, instead of showing the sculptures, he made this massive, like weird adult playground with the sculptures.
Oh yeah, sure.
That is only open for a few days. It's like he's constantly just like, creating these kind of like very, very specific rules and then destroying them like 2 years on or something. In a way that I feel also very honest to the way artists think. I can see that. It's like you read something, he reads about Gestalt, and then he's like, for 3 years, all he can think about is Gestalt.
What's Gestalt? Can you just summarize that for the old
So that's
listeners?
super important for minimalism, or at least the way Morris conceptualized minimalism, which is this idea that, and it relates to art and objecthood, right? So this idea that you get into this space and then you have this, like the whole is this relation between the whole and the parts.
Yeah.
So the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And also this idea that we have these certain images in our head. So one of the things that he does a lot in his sculptures is he uses structures that are quite familiar. So that's why minimalism, or at least his minimalism, uses a lot of like rectangular shapes and like, polygons, like shapes that we mathematically know what they're supposed to be. But then a lot of times he kind of like distorts them a little bit, or he puts them in a way that you can't really see what's on the other side. So you're forced, which is what Fried doesn't like, right? He forces you to go around them and to have a relationship with them in space, to be able to hold the whole thing in your mind. But he's always playing with this idea that you, just by one glimpse, you know what it is, but at the same time, you don't. But again, I think that's just during his like very minimalist phase. And then he goes into other things. And he's also, sorry, 2 more minutes and then I'll stop talking about Morris. But he's also really into Marcuse, and he's really into politics, and he gets involved. And again, like all these people during minimalism are involved in the Art Workers Coalition. They're protesting the Vietnam War. They're occupying museums. They're like, they're taking their shows off. So Morris, but also other artists will get like commissioned by like big museums, and they'll be like, no, we're not gonna do this anymore because we're protesting Vietnam, or we're protesting this, or they're using that space to have like massive political meetings. Which is another thing that you never, Krauss also doesn't mention politics, and politics is such a fundamental part of, when painting doesn't have to be about painting and sculpture doesn't have to be about sculpture, then politics is also something else that becomes a big part of this moment in time.
I think that's nice.
So I recommend everybody should look up Morris.
That's the takeaway. All right, cool. I think that's plenty. Thanks so much to Andrea for talking to me. Thanks to you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next time, we will be speaking about Barbara McCullough's film Shopping Bag Spirits and Freeway Fetishes.